Okay. Do I have a microphone? Not yet. Yeah? They're telling me they can't hear me. Oh, there we go. Okay. Because I love a microphone. Make sure I'm heard. Just kidding. All right, we're going to go ahead and start today. I get the pleasure to introduce Paul. Paul is an assistant professor of history. He started at EOU in the fall of 2023 after completing his dissertation earlier that year titled Climate Crucible, American Choices in Germany, Japan, and the Making of a Great Acceleration, 1939 to 1953. His research, writing, and teaching work engages questions of power, justice, and social environmental change from the local to the planetary scale. Some of the key conversations to which he contributes include the global environmental history of warfare, comparative global history of empires, U.S. foreign policy, commodity history, agricultural history, energy history, history of the Pacific world, diasporic history, U.S. West history, and Asian American history. Paul's first book project will present a new interpretation of American responsibility in shaping trajectories of climate change and the planetary politics of climate injustice at a pivotal moment in the mid-20th century. He approaches this story through comparative study of American debates and decisions on industrialization, resource use, and reparations policy in the post-World War II occupations of Germany and Japan. Combining sources from U.S. military, diplomatic, and intelligence archives with economic and environmental data, Nauert bridges historiography of the U.S. in the 20th century world and environmental humanities scholarship while illuminating roots of the 21st century challenges in the geopolitics of climate justice. He is grateful for the support of the Faculty Scholars Grant last summer in advancing this work by providing him time to produce an article manuscript that will, in turn, inform his first book project. He is also deeply grateful for the intellectual community of EOU that has helped him to make insightful connections across research, writing, and teaching work. Beyond the classroom and archive, some of Paul's professional service and community work on campus and beyond includes fostering queer community, for example, local mentorship with the Mountain Queers, and as a co-founder of Queer at EH, a global network of queer identifying environmental humanities scholars. Other key priorities for Paul include advancing workplace democracy as political action officer of the faculty union and environmental justice, including co-facilitating the LeGrand location of the statewide Earth Summit in March this year, and collaborating with colleagues nationally to explore innovative ways to reduce the travel emissions impacts of conferences. Wow. Please welcome Paul.
All right, testing. We good? All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. It's wonderful to see so many faces of dear friends in the audience and colleagues. If you all bear with me, I'm overcoming a bit of a inner ear condition. So normally I like to walk around the room, but today I'm going to be clutching the podium. So thank you, and with a little soda, but it's very millennial, prebiotic and all natural sugar. Also, as many of you in this room know, and if you don't know, you should know, I will say as a historian of World War II, happy Victory in Europe Day. Today is the 80th anniversary of the destruction of the Third Reich. So, what a day to be talking about the destruction of the military bases of fascism, as much European fascism as much of this lecture will be. All right, so the title of my talk is a slight twist in the article manuscript, An Antidote for War, a quote from one of my historical actors, and then the subtitle, Climate Crucible, Industrial Reparations, and Abandoned Paths of the American Empire in the Long 1940s. I will return to this map as well as all of these key terms. I want to thank, first of all, Angela, for the very generous introduction, again, for you all being here, and special gratitude to EOU and the resources of EOU, our common resources that you all shared in the form of the faculty scholar grant that allowed me to build on my doctoral research over last summer, prepare this article manuscript, and much of the material that you'll see in the talk today. So thank you. As a good teacher, I have a little roadmap for you all. I'll provide big picture context. I'll talk about motivations of my research, some of the historiographic contributions. I prefer the term contribution. While I'm a military historian, I'm not very fond of martial metaphors, so we'll say contribution rather than intervention. There'll be enough military interventions today. Then I will spend the bulk of the talk giving some highlights of key evidence, claims, and the narrative arc of the article manuscript. And then finally, I'll conclude with a conclusion. And then hopefully, I will not go too over and allow some time for Q&A, and I look forward to your all's feedback as I move from this project ever deeper into the first book project. All right, and I'll pull up my notes, and you'll pardon me that I'll rely a little bit more on notes today because of I'm still a little foggy-headed. As many of you know, I'm a historian of the American empire's role in the Anthropocene. We'll talk about the Anthropocene more, particularly its role in the making of the Great Acceleration, which you're seeing up here on the first slide. So let's talk about the Great Acceleration first. Lots of A's: America, acceleration, Anthropocene. The Great Acceleration is an ongoing planetary scale event. It's happening now. It is a massive increase in the rate and volume of global resource use that started soon after World War II, with macro-scale environmental and climate impacts. The signature of the Great Acceleration is this sort of hockey stick chart. This one shows annual carbon dioxide emissions into our atmosphere, our planet's atmosphere, from, well, actually, not quite the start of the Industrial Revolution, but the real acceleration of the Industrial Revolution in Northwestern Europe in the mid-19th century. As some of you may know, and I would argue this fact is even more important in our lifetimes than the 80th anniversary of VE Day today. On March 7th of this year, we hit 430 parts per million atmospheric carbon. The Mauna Loa Observatory, one of the longest places where we have the longest record. This is the first time that we hit 430 ppm of atmospheric carbon in the history of our planetary civilization since the end of the last ice age. The Great Acceleration, as the term connotes, especially for any math or physics professors here today, is all about speed, rates. At the start of the Industrial Revolution, atmospheric carbon dioxide was in the high 200s. When I began grad school in 2016, Earth's atmospheric CO2 levels just passed 400. 7 years later, when I finished my doctorate, we had breached 420. That was a greater increase in those 7 years from the start of the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century to the start of World War I, a period of about 116 years. We've understood, especially the folks in Badgley, for several decades now, that every step past 350 parts per million drives our planet's Earth systems into greater destabilization with no precedent in our species' history since the end of the last ice age. It risks civilizational harms, to say the least, and has already generated irrevocable ecological catastrophe for many biomes and families of species. Every moment we wait to address this makes the lift to reverse this trend and slow this rate that much harder for our children, our students, and our grandchildren. The green box is the Great Acceleration. The Great Acceleration can be seen across a whole host of socio-ecological and socioeconomic metrics. I assume that the slides will be distributed after, so you can zoom in and look at this. Pardon for the poor slide design, there's so much here. 75% of all human carbon dioxide emissions occurred during the Great Acceleration period. Massive increase in terms of, you can look across all sorts of metrics: ocean acidification, fishing and depopulation of fish, the construction of high dams. It could go on and on. There's a lot on this screen. Now, of course, human beings are driving all of this. But we haven't seen any human beings yet. This is where my historical and my historiographic contribution comes in, and I'll talk about this. But I'm building and in conversation with a small but growing group of scholars and historians who are working on this. My research aims to excavate the political history behind the climate history of the Great Acceleration. By political, I mean human choices, debates, personalities. The Great Acceleration is a critical inflection point in the Anthropocene. Scientists recently decided that we were not going to do this, but it was a proposal that was on the table for about a decade among geologists, saying that the Holocene was ended. The period that began at the end of the last ice age. We're now in the Anthropocene. Anthropos, man, and Greek, or human beings. Environmental humanists like me still use the Anthropocene, and it connotes when human beings become a geological force of nature. A very frequent starting date that's pointed to, but there's a lot of debate on where to start this, would be the Industrial Revolution, the work of James Watt. The one that I prefer, of course, as a scholar of World War II, is the first atomic test in the US West in July 1945. So my historiographic intervention is to bring people back into the story of the Anthropocene. Seems perhaps odd if you're not in this historiographic conversation. Why do you need to bring people back into a geological epoch that we are naming for people? But we do, because the first draft of this scholarship, very important, and there's nothing wrong with it at all. I just argue there's an important set of factors missing from this story. Those who set it all in motion. The source of the cause. So the first draft of this scholarship over the last 20 years or so really focused on the effects. And there's a small but growing group of folks who are now trying to focus on those who cause the effects. So as we bring the people back in, what do we see? So this is from 1850 to 2022. Now we're zooming in from 1850 to 1963. So basically the middle, the ascent of British global hegemony to the high water mark of the Cold War and American global hegemony. The blue box is the long momentum of the long 19th century. There is an acceleration well underway as fossil fuel technologies proliferate across the planet. This momentum, if we had stayed on this momentum, it would take about 3,000 to 5,000 years to hit the point that we're at right now in terms of our climate impacts. And this was calculated in the late 19th century. We, of course, are in that dark green box, racing upward ever faster. But there is a middle box, and this is where my scholarship focuses. And we can see it on this chart, but we really have to zoom in to see it. That jagged up and down line of atmospheric carbon emissions, what you're seeing there, and if you look closely at the y-axis, or the x-axis rather, you will see, you can show this, demonstrate to yourself right now. You can see the world mobilizing for total war during World War I, demobilizing. You can see the crash, the global crash of the Great Depression. You can see the mobilization for World War II, and you can see the crash after. This is the entire industrialized world more or less going off the rails. A generation-long period of global war and depression, a type of great derailment. And this tells us immediately that there is nothing foreordained about that hockey stick inflection point. We didn't stay in the long momentum of the 19th century, and we also didn't just inflect into the faster rate. There is this jagged line, period. So, the people still aren't here, and I've promised you people. But we have a little bit more sense of the political history, the world wars, the Great Depression. But I'm bringing in individual people. So who exactly am I bringing in to the Great Acceleration? Well, first clue, if we're going to be talking about total war, global economic systems, an obvious place to begin, and there's so much there that I've stayed there and will probably spend the rest of my life there, although I hope others look at others. American geostrategist. Perhaps clunky term, but a term here I'm summarizing US foreign policymakers, the State Department, their advisors in the public and private sector, senior military leaders, their advisors, and of course, because the American constitutional system, as we'll talk about, concentrates so much decision-making power for the American outward state in the executive, the president. I'm among the historians who call the American empire an empire. We'll bracket that conversation for another time. And I focus on the long 1940s, 39 to 53, more or less, 19. So why bring American geostrategists in? I'm an Americanist. I'm also an American. So I might be susceptible to an accusation of a type of nationalism. But I will say, or I'll put to you, that macroeconomic data says that we absolutely should begin our quest for people in the Great Acceleration with American geostrategists. At this time, 80 years ago, in Victory in Europe Day, the United States comprised or made up 1/3 of the planet's economy. Over half of all factories left on the planet were in the United States. The United States was the world's largest petroleum exporter and consumer. It alone had nuclear weapons. It would have a decisive say in the occupations of the US's leading antagonist in the war, Japan and Germany and elsewhere. And I could go on and on in this list. And also, what's not in this list, the United States was not only at the head of the victorious coalition, the United Nations, in World War II, all other powers, the former and defeated enemies, the rivals, and the allies of the United States, all were devastated by the conflict. Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union likely threw back development in that country by over 10 years. The US alone emerged from the war not stumbling but flying. We alone, and I speak as an American, expanded significantly in our industrial base through our participation in this conflict. So we must begin with the Americans. Focus on the choices. Human beings make choices. I'm also in the camp of scholars, and I debate one of my colleagues in Badgley, Dr. Anthony Stenson, quite a bit on this, but I'm in the camp that we do have free will. And those with the greatest latitude for exercising that free will in terms of geopolitical power, absolutely. American geostrategist 80 years ago in the mid-1940s. So focus on the choices of those helming the American empire and their geostrategic advisors at a critical confluence of planetary history, 1939 to 1950. The Great Acceleration is not yet foreordained, but then comes to be between the start and end of World War II and the start of the Cold War. The launch of the Great Acceleration, the conclusion of this inter-imperial war in 1945, the ascent of what the historian David Kennedy calls American hyperpower, growing decolonization movements across the global south, and the origins of the global Cold War. So American foreign policymakers, when we look at just this big, broad data, these data, and these data, it might be reasonable to assume, and some historians do assume, American foreign policymakers ran fully into the Great Acceleration and led the way. And this is what I expected when I began my doctoral research. But the deeper I went into the archives, I found that there was far more debate and a much wider horizon of political imagination and possibility of what the post-war planet might look like among the very people who had the greatest power, I would argue, to shape or bring those futures into being. Much of the talk today is going to be about futures that were feared, futures that were hoped for, and then the future in which we all live. So I'll talk about abandoned paths and the use of American global power at this critical confluence with profound consequences for the entangled trajectories of these four items above, each of which have massive literatures and debates around. So what's the historiographic upshot of all of this? We expand our understanding of American responsibility in the making of the climate crisis and ultimately the geopolitical terrain of climate injustice. As you'll see, most of this talk on the surface seems to be about war, and it is, but beneath is climate. We will recede from that and then return to that in the conclusion of this talk. Much of the literature around the United States' impact on the Earth's climate systems, there's quite a large literature in both history and especially the sciences, but it focuses on factors of American domestic consumption, very significant. But there are many fewer historians who focus on the impact of US foreign policy on climate systems. So now we're going to plunge backwards in time again. This remarkable expansion of political imagination and largely forgotten post-war policy paths that I'll talk about and uncovered in my research had its origins not at the triumphant emergence of the US as the strongest member of the United Nations coalition. They did not originate on VE Day 80 years ago, but slightly earlier. in the late 1930s through the mid-1940s, before the defeat of the Axis powers, in a set of debates among American geostrategic advisors that really began before the United States entered the war in late 1941. And at a moment of profound uncertainty as the second global war in a generation began in the late 1930s and the very early 1940s. I will get to this map, but I'll let you feel free to observe it, soak it in if you can see it. And this map was produced very shortly. It's an American newspaper map. I will give some commentary on it. An American newspaper map that shows the Earth smashed from above, and it was produced very shortly after Nazi Germany's surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. And the map, if you look closely, and actually forecast a feared future. So American geostrategists in this moment, the late 30s and the very early 40s, viewed the conflict that we now call World War II as fundamentally about who would control trajectories of planetary politics, of course, but also, the more and more you read of their debates, industrialization and resource use over the rest of the 20th century and beyond, after a generation-long period of geopolitical and economic dislocations that destroyed the long momentum of the 19th century. And this was recognized not at the level of climate, but of economy and politics. I'll show in a moment. This slide visually captures this anxiety. This is a Time magazine world map published in July 1941. As fear and uncertainty is flooding the West and all those not aligned with the Axis. The Soviet Union is coded black, and the assumption at this point is that, as George Marshall told FDR, the US president this time, the Nazis will be at Lake Baikal by Thanksgiving. So there's an assumption that the Soviet Union will be militarily defeated, and this was, of course, the plan of the Nazis, its resources metabolized into the Third Reich to create a counterbalance to American hegemony in the world. This was understood and feared by American geostrategists at the time. So, speculating on planetary futures at this confluence of global political and environmental history defined by radical uncertainty, in this moment, one problem loomed above all others, the problem of recurrent global war. Another global war was happening in a single human lifetime. You could fight in both of these conflicts. They were so close. In the late 1930s, FDR, the US president at this time, the US State Department was far, far smaller and had no real sort of think tank apparatus, assembled a group of academic advisors from across the United States and a few beyond the US, and charged them with helping folks who specialize in international economics, international relations, as we'd say today, charged them with advising State Department officials in the shape of the post-war world and analysis of different potential futures. In this moment, American geostrategists turned from explanations that focused on ideology and political processes towards environmental factors. Now, why is this? It's the second global war. The Cold War has not yet happened, and it's difficult to explain, for example, why Germany, with a very different political ideology than it had in World War I, was once again the leading antagonist in Europe. There's much more to it than this, but there's a departure from ideological explanation of is this country a democracy or not, and more towards environmental factors, and by this I mean control of industry or resources. There's particularly focus on, these are my terms, not the terms of the actors, transnational or trans-imperial patterns of industrial geography in the global north, so distribution of factories across the borders of Europe and Asia in particular, and then resource flows from the global south produced by extractivist colonialism, biological goods, fossil fuels, metals. You see traces of this in this map. So, this group that FDR assembles, they're drawn mostly from the Council on Foreign Relations, which still exists today. And this group is a sort of boys' club. There are very few women in this club, overwhelmingly people like me. White dudes with elite educations who love to nerd out about foreign policy in economics, political science, and history. These guys are assembled in a very innocuous-sounding group, the War and Peace Studies Group. It sounds like we're just doing a book club. They produce hundreds of reports. They have staffs that do all sorts of research. And I'm pulling from the books and books, or report after report after report. Prepared, I'll give you some material, but I'm going to start with something that predates slightly the War and Peace Studies Group. This is from, at the time, a very famous economist, not as famous as the British economist John Maynard Keynes, who's pictured here, the tall guy, the shorter guy, Alvin Hansen, an economist at Harvard. And he gave this presidential address at the American Economic Association in 1938. And you'll see here even using the language of acceleration. According to him, the global upheaval since World War I offered overwhelming testimony in support of the thesis that the economic order of the Western world is undergoing in this generation structural change no less basic and profound in character than the transformation of economic life and industries, which we designate loosely by the phrase, the Industrial Revolution. We are passing over a divide which separates the great era of growth and expansion of the 19th century, the long momentum, from an era which no man, unwilling to embark on pure conjecture, can as yet characterize with clarity or precision. We're moving swiftly out of the order in which those of our generation were brought up into no one knows what. This or something else. Now, in response to this impasse, Hansen calls for an acceleration, the progress of science and technology, more R&D investment. Because if growth stops, it will be disastrous, particularly for the liberal capitalist economies. But he admits technology cannot create a new world or make the old one bigger than it is. I mean, there are, even at this point, people want to go to Mars, but it's more widely seen as a pipe dream. Now, Elizabeth Schumpeter, one of the very few women in the War and Peace study groups, and she's there because she is by far the English language leading expert of the economy of the Empire of Japan, has this to say in this magnum opus around the Empire of Japan that she's finishing just as the Nazis are plunging across Western Europe in the spring of 1940. It is easy to comprehend, even if it is impossible to approve of the ambitions of the military of Japan. Of the great powers, Japan was exceeded in population only by Russia and the United States. These are the only two powers which are rich in territory and raw materials in their own right. We set aside all the colonization of Siberia and the US West. England, France, Germany, and Italy and Japan are all comparatively poor in territory and resources as far as the home country is concerned. So not ideological division here, notice. She brackets by environmental factors. England and France acquired large sections of the Earth's territory and resources for their respective empires in the course of the 19th century, as did the Netherlands and Belgium. Germany, Italy, and Japan now wish to do likewise, at whatever cost to the peace of the world. Over the rest of 1941 and into the rest of 1940 and into 1941, Schumpeter and her fellow brain trust, Imperial brain trusters. So FDR convened a group of academics earlier in his administration called the Brain Trust to advise largely on domestic policy. Historians call this second brain trust, the War and Peace Studies group, the Imperial Brain Trust, since they're focused on the American Empire. Schumpeter and the other Imperial brain trusters threw themselves into surveying planetary resource geography, patterns of industrialization, all to recommend to where U.S. foreign policymakers should focus in preparing for a possible post-war worst-case scenario as the peace of the world continued to unravel. This is the worst-case scenario. In the words of another member of the War and Peace Studies group, Hansen, writing again now in a report, a confidential report, imagines this scenario in June 1940, when he believed, quote, only a miracle could stop the, quote, German onslaught. He said, at worst case, Nazi leaders would reduce the world historical leader, these are my summary terms, I'll quote when I'm saying I'm quoting from him, the United Kingdom to an agrarian society with a population equal to Ireland by the year 2000, so projecting out to this point, while ensuring Germany emerged unchallenged as the, quote, great manufacturing center of all of Europe, end quote, by metabolizing the vast hydrocarbons and carbohydrates of the defeated Soviet Union. The invasion has not yet happened, something that this early July 1941 map imagined as imminent. Hansen then predicted a Nazi hegemon would face off with the United States in a new type of Cold War that he feared could last, quote, centuries. To prepare for such a future, the Imperial Brain Trust insisted tighter planning was immediately necessary to ensure the United States had access to resource flows from the global south produced through systems of extractivist colonialism. A particular concern was the possibility realized in late 1941 that Japanese imperial expansion might block US access to Asian biological and mineral imports, which play a very important role in critical areas of the US economy at this point. So, zooming in, count this country black if the Nazis win, a quick and complete victory, the Soviet Union. This map is the vision of the nightmare scenario for these policymakers, and many in the world at this point. This map, made 1 year later, or later in the year, is a map depicting a post-Axis world. None of the Axis powers are there. Germany and Japan are, but there's no longer an Axis. The other European colonial empires are there, but they're muted. It's a type of incomplete utopia, and it is a world after war. This is a commemorative map made to celebrate the Atlantic Charter, signed in August 1941, that eventually becomes the foundational document of the United Nations as a military coalition and as a type of international government. This map suggests visually what the Charter promises textually. The ideological terms of the Atlantic Charter center rights to resources and rising standards of living. The banner waves over a map full of resources, which loom even larger than political boundaries. The lower left, I'll zoom into here, provides a clue and indicates a much wider debate happening among scholars and advisors around US foreign policy makers. And here the map draws on a very ancient image and even quotes the book of Isaiah. This ancient narrative, foreign policy makers and publics around the world saw in this narrative, ancient narrative, something deep about the nature of tools. A tool is determined by its use. It is a weapon when used as a weapon. Steel makes better plows, but also tanks. So here's a man banging a tank into a plow, swords into plowshares. In a very modern sense, war potential, and this is an actor term, war potential, becomes a central term and problem in this debate. So how does this debate work? And here I'm summarizing a very complex conversation among these advisors. Oh, and in late 1941, to give you some historical context, a few months after the Atlantic Charter is signed, Japan attacks American and European colonies across the Pacific, and the US is drawn into the war. Over 1942, German advances into the Soviet Union falter, and by the end of 1942, so we're moving very quickly through a few very dense years, the military tide turns against the Axis, and this moment of fear passes for a Nazi-dominated planetary future as the US entered the war, and the Soviet Union and China did not collapse. But the fixation on environmental factors and the problem of global war only deepened among American strategists as they started to think about how do we reach the utopian second map now that the moment of danger for that first map has passed. The fate of the industrial infrastructure of Germany and Japan were unsurprisingly at the center of these debates, since they were recognized as making possible this conflict. So this is how the cycle of modern global war works. These are my summary terms among these advisors. They argue expanding industrialization in a country demands increasing resource inputs. They see this pattern all over the 19th and early 20th century world. If you run out of resources, think of what Schumpeter was saying in the home country. You then have to embark on a quest around the world for more resources. And if someone's not willing to sell them to you, this gives very good justification to the leaders of a society to turn towards violence and coercion. But of course, you need more resources to wage war. Industrialization then expands if you win these wars, and war potential grows. But you've now stepped on this treadmill of expanding industrialization, so you need yet more resources. And the treadmill never stops until you voluntarily stop fighting wars, or you lose, or you run out of resources. Okay. So, starting in late 1944, scores of experts and a huge the U.S. Foreign Economic Administration, another huge agency that has been developed during the war, crunches huge amounts of economic data to determine what it would take, in FDR's words, to control Germany's power and capacity to make war in the future. Find the war potential so that we can make policy that cuts it out. Great, there's war potential and the potential. But the tank, if it can be a plowshare, the plowshare is war potential. So, after months of study, even at the level of a single factory, these experts could find no technology that could not be turned from making peaceful tools to weapons. Given the will of leaders or a population, any industrial base could be repurposed into what these advisors called, quote, the complex organism of a war industry's aggregate. Such a finding yielded no clear verdict for industrialization in post-war Japan or Germany, and more disturbingly, raised unsettling questions about the nature of industrialization itself. No one was prepared to completely eliminate industrialization, but there's a growing recognition that industrialization always carries within itself an inherent war potential. So two camps emerge. I'm not going to make you suffer through me reading about coal in Western Germany and everything on this slide. And two major camps emerge among US foreign policy advisors. One camp, Schumpeter and the current Secretary of War at the time, Henry Stimson, say, rebuild Germany and Japan. Ensure that they are brought into whatever alliance and security system the United States controls after the war, but rebuild them as historical hubs of industry in Europe and Japan. Another camp emerges and says, well, if we've concluded that massive industrial concentration has war potential, then we should not entrust our defeated enemies with this war potential again. So perhaps we should reduce levels of industrialization around the world. Perhaps we should embrace nascent movements against anti-colonialism or nascent anti-colonial movements to try to push for industrialization in the global south and elsewhere where it is not developed as fully, a more equal world. Fast forwarding and now zooming in, October 24th, 1944, to give you a sense of where we're at. US troops have just occupied the first major German city in the west, Aachen. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is underway in the Philippines. It's a 100,000 square mile battle. And this is what the President of the United States, FDR, is writing to the Secretary of State on that day. In our meetings with other nations, I have a feeling that too little attention is being paid to the subject of conservation and the use of resources. Many different kinds of natural resources are being wasted. Many nations have been denuded of trees. He loves trees. He has his whole life. And therefore, he tries to grow redwoods at Hyde Park. Find it extremely difficult to live on eroded lands. I'm surprised that the world knows so little about itself. Now, while he's certainly not alluding to him, I mean, this has heavy shades of Hegel, Marx, and Lukács here. And then FDR says it could do no harm for us to hold a meeting of all the United and Associated Nations for what is really the first step towards conservation, a gathering for the purpose of a worldwide study of the whole subject. I'm more and more convinced that conservation is a base of permanent peace. And here, not shades. It's very likely he's, of course, referencing Kant. So an international governance structure focused on perpetual peace, but at its heart, a type of ecological sensibility. I need to be moving quite a bit faster. So let's speed this story up. Two camps emerge. And then the president, well, he doesn't quite say what he thinks. He doesn't say here at all, and never is very cagey about the fate of German and Japanese industrial base, because he's the lead negotiator, and FDR is just famously cagey in terms of any sort of commitment he'll give to anyone. There are two major camps that have emerged, and the president does seem to probably lean towards this second camp, if we want to make a sort of assessment in the present. But here's where something comes in that some historians hate and some love, depending on their intellectual personality. Contingency in a huge counterfactual. On April 12th, 1945, FDR suffers what is probably a terrible aneurysm in his head, and he dies almost immediately. Someone new becomes president. This is the nature of the American constitutional system. FDR, like many presidents before and presidents after, chooses his vice president, Harry S. Truman from my home state, who has almost no no foreign policy knowledge or interest, but a successful politician in the U.S. Senate, and, I'll get to this, highly connected, especially to the treasurer of the Democratic Party. FDR chooses Truman, replacing his then very progressive vice president, sincere anti-racist Henry Wallace, with Harry S. Truman. So when FDR dies, in the very moment, the very last weeks of the European War, in the very last months of the Pacific War, the United States and the United Nations are at the gates of Germany and Japan, past the gates in the case of Germany. FDR, who concentrates all this power, not just constitutionally, but in terms of personality, he loves being his own Secretary of State, in his own hands. He dies, and all the decisions about what to do are thrust on Harry S. Truman. And this question of the fate of German and Japanese industrial infrastructure, this is just one subpart of one of the many top priority questions he has to face. So with little foreign policy experience, Truman delegates. And he delegates it to the guy on the left here, who's holding a solid silver model battleship in a basement vault of the Bank of Japan in Tokyo in December 1945. We'll get to why he's there. Edwin W. Pauley, a millionaire oil man from the West Coast in California, who made part of his fortune selling oil to Imperial Japan in their invasion of China in the 1930s. This guy parlays his oil wealth to rise high in the Democratic Party, to become the treasurer of the Democratic Party. He prevails upon FDR, claims that he's one of the key figures, and he is. He tries to take all the credit, of replacing Henry Wallace, who he doesn't like, with what we call today a corporate Democrat, much more to the liking of the centrist in the Democratic Party, Harry S. Truman. So Truman turns around and rewards Pauly once he's president by giving him a plum ambassadorship and a seat in the cabinet. I'm going to make you the ambassador in reparations. What will Germany and Japan have to pay to the United Nations after they are defeated? So this oil man embarks to Europe in the last days of May 1945 and early June 1945 on a trip that will eventually almost circle the planet twice. And he brings with many of his trusted business advisors and also new dealers who had been recruited in the last months of FDR's life. It's a very awkward shotgun marriage. The intellectuals don't want to be talking to the industrialist, and no love is lost. And it seems almost overdetermined at this point that Pauly is going to kind of do whatever is going to garner him the most fame. He has his eyes on Secretary of the Navy and possibly even the presidency after that. So big what if here. What if FDR had lived? What if he had not replaced him with Truman? And then another big what if, but we live in this timeline. Pauly arrives in Europe. He meets survivors of the Holocaust. He sees devastation across not just Western Europe, but the Soviet Union, where he spends a significant period of time. He eventually travels to Asia, where he sees devastation in China, in Southeast Asia, in Japan itself. For whatever reason, he is drawn to talk to people, ordinary people, not just leaders. Photos here where he's meeting child survivors of the Holocaust. And then the other photo, farmers in rural Japan. These experiences bring together the industrialists and the intellectuals on his mission, and they transform Pauly into an ardent believer that there can never be a war like this again. And among many of his advisors are those who were sitting in on the debates that I spent most of this lecture narrating. And Pauly himself is very inclined to think of the world in terms of environmental factors, since his whole career is built around the extraction of oil and selling it to different industries. As Pauly travels, he finds that there's a significant amount of German and Japanese factories left. And he says, okay, and this is a function of how the air war worked. I can talk more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. We should not be rebuilding those factories there or giving them back to Germany and Japan. What we should do is break them down, dismantle them, put them on boats and trains, and move them around the world to become the kernels of industrialization elsewhere in the world, so that we thereby break the cycle of global war through a more even pattern of industrialization around the world. Pauly, over about 18 months of travel and formulating different reports with his team, submits these reports to Truman. Their recommendations are written into initial occupation policy in Western Germany and in Japan. And over the first year or so of US occupation in Germany, this process begins underway. The planning begins in Japan as well. All said and done, over 1,500 factories in Germany are ultimately broken down and redistributed, and there are plans for many, many more. This map gives you a sense of some of the places where these factories would be sent around the world to try to create new industrial centers rather than those 5 major centers that exist in the world in the mid-1940s. This is what it looks like. This is from a US military occupation government document from the first year of the occupation in Germany. So breaking these factories down and systematically sending them elsewhere. Since we're running short on time, I won't bore you with all these economic data, but very significant transformations of Germany and Japan's economy towards a type of deindustrialization, not full, but major, to spark industrialization elsewhere. Now, we don't live in this world. Germany and Japan, of course, are major industrial and economic powerhouses. So what happens? I'm going to skip all of the details of this slide rather than reading through them in depth, but to make a very long story short, there are There are those who've been arguing for redistributing industrial infrastructure that have now crystallized around poly by the mid or the late 1940s. And then there are others who say, this is absolutely foolish. We will never be able to create a world without war. So instead of trying to foolishly strive towards this, we should be shoring up our US advantage everywhere we can in the world. So it's build Germany, Western Germany and Japan back up, because by the end of the 1940s, they were perceived as ours, part of the American empire. And let me give you a flavor of some of this from George F. Kennan, famous for other reasons like containment. But he claimed stopping the redistribution of industrial infrastructure from Japan, he said, this was the second most important achievement of my entire foreign policy career. And Kennan is wonderful for saying the quiet parts out loud. He's writing this in a memo arguing against Pauli and his team. We Americans have about half the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. We can't, I'm going to paraphrase, people are going to be envious of us. Now, we can't maintain this position. Our real task is to maintain this position while also maintaining security. Translation, keep hoarding the world's wealth disproportionately, but make sure if anyone tries to take it from us, we can beat them down successfully. Meanwhile, in Asia, and there's a lot of dated and racist language here that I won't read aloud, further hunger, distress, and violence are inevitable. The process of adaptation will be long and violent to the modern world, he means. We could not hope to combat it without a diversion of far greater portion of our national effort than our people would ever willingly concede to such a purpose. So Kennan is also very condescending to Americans, if you're not catching this here. We don't want to give any of our resources to help people who are hungry in Asia. He says, we should dispense with the aspiration to be liked or to be regarded as the repository of high-minded international altruism, like the Atlantic Charter. We should cease to talk about vague and, for the Far East, unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of living standards, and democratization. The day is not far off when we're going to have to deal in straight power concepts. The less we are then hampered by idealistic slogans, the better. 2 years later, the Korean War begins. The United States ultimately levels every significant city and town in the north. And a large part of American war materiel in this conflict is supplied by a reindustrialized Japan and, well, talked about less, a reindustrializing Western Germany, so that the American factories can focus on the very goods that American consumers desire. So at a longer conclusion, but I'll leave you with this quote and a brief comment on it. This is from Walter Benjamin, a Jewish-German philosopher and historian who has been one of the stars that I've steered by as a scholar for a long time. To articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it, quote, the way it really was, Ronke, a famous German historian. It means instead to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. As in the last document that Benjamin writes, he unsuccessfully flees the Nazi advance in Europe. I've presented a memory for you all today, and we are in a moment of grave danger. Entangled, accelerating climate crisis, a world on the knife edge of total war, and a world defined by deep inequalities in development. And I present this story of unexpected twists and turns, fear and hope, an unexpected sort of heroic figure transformed by openness and vulnerability to the places he travels to try to push for a world without war. Imagination to try to stop war, not through just ideological means, by intervention into economies and our relationship ultimately to nature. So I offer this memory in this moment of danger, and this is what I hope to do in my book and what I strive to do in this scholarly project. Thank you for letting me take more time in this talk, and I'm happy to take any questions, although I know we have little time. So find me. I'm in Ackerman 204C, always happy to nerd out about this stuff. Thank you, guys.
We have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you, Paul. That was really fascinating, the connections that you made. I was wondering about this War and Peace or Studies group, the Imperial group. How early did the World Bank and the IMF come into play as a tool for empire?
Good, great. Excellent question. Thank you, Peter. So, some of you may know this. Bretton Woods Conference, which is, okay, so there's a major, World War II is like the era of great international conferences. FDR is a type of academic in a way that he loves conferences. He's always convening conferences, bringing people together, and these conferences, there's one in like aviation, a bunch of different stuff. The work of these conferences are to imagine what the post-war world will look like. One of the biggest of the big conferences is the Bretton Woods Conference that happens in 1944. And at this conference, the discussion is, what is the world going to look like, not just after the defeat of the Axis, but anticipating the decline of the British Empire and what at the time is much of the world's reserve currency, the British pound. The US, of course, is an economic ascent. It's hit all those metrics I showed you on that earlier slide. So this is another moment of critical confluence. There's a real moment of possibility of, okay, there's going to be a big transition between these two planetary hegemons. Their rivals are going to be defeated. In the capitalist world, we have a unique opportunity to plan the capitalist world in advance before it really unfolds, and to look at critical questions around currency that are usually litigated through geopolitical conflict. Keynes famously says that there should be a single reserve currency that is not connected to any individual country. So this would be a very different world economic system, because it would then deny control of the global reserve currency to any great power that had its own individual interest. For a bunch, there are books written about many facets of this conference, but more or less historians will point to Bretton Woods as a critical moment where this dream reaches both its peak and it is defeated. The reserve currency ultimately, of course, becomes the US dollar, and we're now in the midst of a process of probably de-dollarization around the world. And it is, I mean, I'm not an IR, my degree is not in IR or economics, but I feel very confident in saying that it is an impossible contradiction to have a global reserve currency that's also connected to the particular interest of one country. So Keynes and others had this idea, but overthrown. The IMF is another story in this period, as well as the World Bank. The World Bank is less effectively taken over by the interest of Anglo-American empire. The IMF and the weaponization of the IMF that happens in the later 20th century is another story, but I'd say the politics of currency at this point are really, really important. The other thing that I'll say is the US is the world's major creditor. That's probably hard for us to imagine today, but the US is the overwhelming creditor of the world. And this situation really happens, really crystallizes actually in World War I.
How does the emergence of the United Nations within this play out within this context?
Oh, great. Chris, if I could ask you to elaborate which aspect of the United Nations? Give me a little more. Because I could talk a long time.
Oh, I'm not sure I can. Its very existence is quite interesting. But I'm sorry. Its very existence is quite interesting, given the failure of the League of Nations. But also, it would appear in sort of the way the United Nations has played out that these forces have competed within the United Nations.
Correct.
In how they manifest.
Correct. I understand. So the United Nations is it begins as a term of propaganda for the anti-fascist military coalition. And I say coalition because not all the allies are allies with one another, if that makes sense, in a treaty sense. So the Atlantic Charter is built on FDR's 4 freedoms, rhetorically and ideologically: the freedom from want, fear, and then the freedom to worship as you choose, and free speech. The Atlantic Charter enshrines those, and it's more or less a revival of Wilson's 14 points, a distillation, so political rights with a bunch of social rights. You can think of it at a very high level. The way I'll teach it in a lecture is 14 points of Wilsonian internationalism now merged with insights of the New Deal. The Atlantic Charter, when there's a declaration of the United Nations on January 1st, 1942 that the Soviet Union signs and other belligerents, they say our values in this war that we will fight for are the Atlantic Charter. And then when you read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the language, there's a direct through line from the 4 freedoms. So we can follow the United Nations at the level of ideology, at the level of a sort of marketing campaign, at the level of military coalition. What we mean by the United Nations when we talk about it most frequently in the news the multilateral structure, the General Assembly and the Security Council and all of these bodies, this emerges through a series of conferences that culminated at a conference in October 1945 in San Francisco, where the charter itself is signed. And of course, League of Nations looms over everyone. The League of Nations actually has a legal existence until, I think, 1946. So there's also a transition between these two. The thought is that if we bring in more social and economic rights, there will be more buy-in. And very importantly, and FDR is at the heart of this, talk about another sort of contradiction, issue with the League of Nations, each empire gets one vote in the League of Nations, but there is no strong executive body. So FDR, Churchill, and Stalin agree on what becomes, FDR initially calls it the world's 4 policemen. So it's the big 3, the Soviet Union, the UK, the US. FDR personally insists that China be added. FDR is a very long-range thinker. He's like, China has to be there. This is before the communists prevail in the Civil War. And the Roosevelts are close with the Songs, the family of Chiang Kai-shek, that Chiang Kai-shek marries into. And then to make sure that the UK has an extra vote against the Americans, Churchill insists that France be added to the Security Council. This also gives it a nice, an odd number, which is important. So the United Nations merges the idea of an egalitarian assembly, League of Nations, and then so it's a Kantian idea, a world parliament, but it also brings in a Metternichian idea, a concert of great powers. So the Security Council is the concert of great powers. And of course, like, one only needs to be a parent or an aunt and uncle to think about how this probably will not work out. And of course, the people assembling it know it's not going to work out. But under the pressure of the common enemy, they hope, well, we'll put this together and maybe we'll figure it out later. And the Security Council is at, I'll just say my own view, the Security Council, I think just as historical fact in the Cold War, becomes this central piece of dysfunction in the United Nations organization. We certainly see that today. So there's a contradiction between a permanent group of policemen who get to rule over everyone and have veto power over everything and over one another, and then the World Parliament. This hasn't been resolved yet, obviously. Yeah. Yeah.
Nancy, do you have a question? This will be the last question.
Thank you. This is really interesting. I'm more familiar with the 70s and later. Mm-hmm. But I'm interested particularly in discourse around the idea of peace.
Oh.
And
yeah.
by the 70s, I think people are starting to realize that peace isn't just ceasefire. It involves equity. And I can see the threads of those ideas emerging here. Can you speak a little bit about how people are defining peace in this sort of moment where total war is happening?
Absolutely, yeah. And I will just read directly from the Atlantic Charter, because you've already identified the threads. And I'll let you all think about this. So there are 8 points to the Atlantic Charter. First, countries will seek no aggrandizement, territorial or other. So for the first time in human history, saying wars of conquest are categorically immoral. Secondly, the nations desire to see no territorial changes that do not accord with the freely expressed wishes of the people concerned. As you go on, as I continue to read, keep in mind, Hitler has a knife to the throat of England. And it is, in my view, only because of this situation that Winston Churchill, who is an arch imperialist and died in the war, racist, and permits the death of 3 million at least Bengalis of starvation during the conflict on grounds that have no military justification, in my view. Churchill is compelled by FDR to sign on to an Atlantic Charter that has very anti-colonial language in it. Third, they respect the right of all peoples, Churchill particularly did not like this, to choose the form of government under which they will live, and they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who had been forcibly deprived of them. Stalin, by the way, signs on to this later with the Declaration of the United Nations in early 1942. Also, I mean, Hitler's knife is being driven into the Soviet Union, so Stalin just signs the thing. I'll leave it to you to decide who had their fingers crossed behind their back. Fourth, they will endeavor with due respect for their existing obligations to further the enjoyment by all states, great or small, victor or vanquished, of access on equal terms to the trade and to the raw materials of the world which are needed for their economic prosperity. So this is an attempt to square the circle of the U.S. wants a free trade order to export U.S. manufactured goods, but they're also saying, in effect, colonial areas of the world should be able to self-govern if they like, and they should be able to sell their commodities as they wish rather than being forced to sell them to a colonial master. Fifth, they desire to bring about the fullest collaboration between all nations in the economic field with the object of securing for all, Churchill doesn't like this either, improved labor standards. This is unimaginable less than a generation earlier that the most powerful people in the world would be voluntarily and publicly committing themselves to this. This is a fruit of generations and generations going back to the 19th century of the labor movement that culminate in the New Deal. And elements of labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. Sixth, after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, accomplished 80 years ago today, they hope to see established a world which will afford to all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their own boundaries, and which will afford assurance that all men in all the lands, Churchill hated this phrase, may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want. For freedoms, such a peace should enable all men to traverse the high seas and oceans without hindrance. This is about migration. Eighth, they believe all the nations of the world, for realistic as well as spiritual reasons, must come to the abandonment of the use of force. I mean, this outright embrace of pacifism, in a sense, pending the establishment of a wider and permanent system of general security. The disarmament of such nations is essential. They will likewise aid and encourage all other practical measures which will lighten for peace-loving peoples the crushing burden of armaments. For all of us who live on this side of the Cold War, I mean. Yeah. What's remarkable is that, like, this was the utopian future imagined. And what this does for those in later post-war peace movements, civil rights movement, environmentalist movements, something to say at least it was promised at some point. The broken promise has great political power. As we know in American domestic history, all men are created equal. It's, of course, gendered language. It's language, though, that has been pointed to repeatedly by movements for racial and gender and sexual minority justice in this country. Even if we know Jefferson didn't mean it on some level, it was said. It is there. It was a promise that was made. It can be redeemed, even if it has been broken again and again and again. So, yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Dr. Nauert.